On May 23, 2026, at 8:37 in the morning, police in Hobart, Wisconsin responded to a disturbance call at a private residence. Dispatchers had heard yelling and swearing over an open 911 line before the call disconnected. By the time officers arrived, they were walking into what would become one of the more closely watched domestic violence cases in the NFL this year, involving a Pro Bowl running back originally booked on 5 separate charges, one of them a felony. More than 3 months later, the actual formal charges filed look considerably different from what that initial arrest suggested, and the gap between those two things is worth walking through carefully. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we're covering the case against Green Bay Packers running back Josh Jacobs, built from court documents, police reports, and reporting that has tracked this case since the arrest itself. We want to walk through exactly what happened, exactly what's changed since May, and exactly what remains unresolved, because this is a case where the difference between an initial arrest and a formal charge tells a story of its own. Quick anchor before we go further. Josh Jacobs was arrested on May 23, 2026, on 5 charges connected to a domestic incident at his home in Hobart, Wisconsin, just outside Green Bay. He was released the following day. On August 27th, more than 3 months later, the Brown County District Attorney's Office formally charged him with 2 misdemeanors: battery and criminal damage to property. He has not been charged with domestic violence, strangulation, or intimidation of a victim, despite those charges appearing on the original arrest booking. He is presumed innocent unless and until convicted in a court of law, and everything we discuss in this episode should be understood with that presumption firmly in place. Let's start with who Josh Jacobs is, because context matters here the way it always does. Jacobs is 28 years old, entering his 8th NFL season. He was drafted 24th overall by the Las Vegas Raiders in 2019, spent his first 5 seasons there, and led the entire NFL in rushing yards in 2022 with over 1,600 yards, earning All-Pro honors that year. He signed with the Green Bay Packers in 2024 and has continued performing at a high level, rushing for over 1,300 yards that first season and just under 930 yards with 13 touchdowns last season. Across his career, he's accumulated more than 7,800 rushing yards and 74 touchdowns, a genuinely accomplished professional athlete by any measure, and someone who, notably, was allowed to continue practicing and playing for the Packers throughout the months between his arrest and this week's formal charges. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment before we go further, because it tells you something about how the legal and organizational process around a case like this one actually unfolds in real time, rather than the way it's sometimes assumed to work from the outside. An arrest is not a conviction, and in this specific case, it also wasn't treated as grounds for immediate suspension or removal from the team, a fact that becomes more interesting once you understand exactly what he was originally booked on. Now let's walk through what actually happened that morning, based on the criminal complaint and police report that have since become public. According to the report, Jacobs' girlfriend, referred to in court documents only by the initials A&M, became upset after going through his phone and discovering he'd been talking to other women. When she attempted to retrieve her own phone from him, he did not return it, and instead grabbed her arm, beginning what the report describes as a physical struggle lasting several minutes. Jacobs then left the residence in one vehicle, taking her phone with him, while she took his other vehicle. The two eventually returned to the home separately. According to A&M's account to police, during the altercation, Jacobs grabbed her as she tried to leave, threw her to the ground, and caused her to strike her head. Separately, surveillance footage recovered from Jacobs' own garage reportedly shows part of this encounter directly. A&M on the garage floor, Jacobs taking her phone, and then returning approximately 40 seconds later and appearing to damage the device. That footage, according to NFL Insider reporting that reviewed portions of the criminal complaint, is specific enough that seeing it directly, rather than simply knowing it exists, could carry real weight in how both the legal process and the NFL's own separate investigation proceed from here. We want to pause on that distinction because it's one worth understanding clearly. There's a meaningful difference between a case built entirely on competing verbal accounts of what happened behind closed doors and a case where at least part of the alleged incident was captured on video by a camera neither party was necessarily thinking about in the moment. Garage security systems are common enough now that this isn't unusual. but it does mean that whatever additional detail that footage contains, beyond what's been reported in secondhand summaries so far, exists as a fixed, reviewable record rather than something that depends entirely on memory or interpretation. At the time of his arrest, Jacobs was booked on 5 charges: battery, criminal damage to property, and disorderly conduct, all connected to domestic abuse, along with a felony charge of strangulation and suffocation and a charge of intimidating a victim. That's a considerably more serious set of charges than what was ultimately filed. When the Brown County District Attorney's Office formally charged Jacobs this past Thursday, more than 3 months after the arrest, the charges that actually stuck were 2 Class A misdemeanors, battery and criminal damage to property. The felony strangulation charge, the domestic abuse designations, and the victim intimidation charge do not appear in the formal complaint. We think this gap deserves careful, honest attention because it's exactly the kind of detail that gets flattened in either direction if you're not careful with it. District Attorney David Lacey addressed the timing directly in his own statement, saying his office sought to ensure a fair and complete review of available evidence, some of which only recently became available to our office due to significant, ongoing forensic efforts by law enforcement. He also included language worth quoting precisely. A criminal complaint is nothing more than a written, formal accusation against a defendant alleging the commission of criminal offenses and does not raise any inference of guilt. Mr. Jacobs is presumed innocent of these charges. There are a few honest ways to read the 3-month gap between arrest and formal charges, and we don't think any single one of them is obviously correct without more information than has currently been made public. It could reflect prosecutors genuinely needing that time to review forensic evidence, including the garage footage, carefully enough to determine what charges the evidence could actually support at trial, a process that, done properly, takes real time regardless of public pressure to move faster. It could also reflect a case where the initial, more serious charges made at the moment of arrest, which police departments generally file based on preliminary information and probable cause rather than a fully developed evidentiary record, simply didn't hold up once prosecutors examined everything more closely. Both of those explanations are consistent with ordinary, unremarkable criminal procedure, and neither one requires assuming anything sinister about either the initial arrest or the ultimate charging decision. Jacobs' attorneys, a team that includes David Chesnoff, Richard Schoenfeld, and Clarence Dushak, released a statement following the formal charges that specifically emphasized what wasn't included. The Brown County District Attorney has reviewed evidence and elected to file misdemeanor charges against Josh that do not include domestic violence, the statement read. The allegations will be addressed in court and not in the media. Mr. Jacobs respects the district attorney's office and the process it followed. We think that statement is worth reading precisely rather than dismissing or overcrediting. It's true, as a factual matter, that the formal charges don't carry a domestic violence designation specifically. It's also true that Wisconsin's legal definitions of domestic violence-related offenses don't always map cleanly onto how the public understands that term colloquially. And a misdemeanor battery charge stemming from an altercation between intimate partners can still fall within the practical scope of what the NFL's own personal conduct policy treats as domestic violence for the purposes of league discipline, regardless of how the specific criminal charge is formally labeled under Wisconsin law. That distinction actually matters enormously for what happens next, because it's not just prosecutors watching this case closely. The NFL has its own separate, independent conduct policy that operates regardless of how a criminal case resolves, and it's worth explaining exactly how that policy works, because it's frequently misunderstood. Under the league's personal conduct policy, a first offense involving domestic violence carries a baseline suspension of 6 games. Crucially, that policy doesn't require a criminal conviction to trigger discipline. The league conducts its own independent investigation and can impose discipline based on its own findings, even in cases where criminal charges are reduced, dropped entirely, or never filed at all. NFL spokesperson Brian McCarthy has said the league has been closely monitoring all developments in the matter, which remains under review. Language that leaves the door open for the league's own process to proceed on its own timeline, separate from whatever Wisconsin's court system ultimately decides. Packers general manager Brian Gutekunst confirmed publicly that the organization has been preparing for the possibility of a suspension during the 2026 season, telling reporters, "We'll deal with that when it comes." But we've obviously been preparing for that in case that happens. A statement that suggests the organization itself expects some form of league discipline, regardless of how the criminal case resolves. We think it's worth explaining why the NFL's process and the criminal justice system can reach different conclusions from the same underlying facts, because that's not a contradiction. It's simply how two separate systems, with two separate purposes and two separate standards of proof, are designed to work. A criminal prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest standard in American law, specifically because a conviction carries the weight of the state's power to imprison someone. The NFL's personal conduct policy operates under a considerably different standard, closer to what's used in most workplace or contractual disciplinary contexts, where the league simply needs to determine, through its own investigation, whether conduct occurred that violates the terms of a player's employment agreement with the league. That's why a criminal case that results in reduced charges, a plea deal, or even an acquittal doesn't automatically mean the NFL's own investigation reaches the same conclusion, and it's also why the league has historically been willing to impose suspensions in cases where criminal prosecution didn't result in a conviction at all. Let's talk about what the specific charges Jacobs is actually facing mean in practice. Battery, as a Class A misdemeanor in Wisconsin, generally involves intentionally causing bodily harm to another person without their consent. Criminal damage to property covers intentionally damaging property belonging to someone else. In this case, reportedly, the phone Jacobs allegedly took from A&M and later damaged. Both charges, as Class A misdemeanors, carry a maximum penalty of 9 months in jail each under Wisconsin law, and multiple outlets have reported the combined maximum exposure at up to 18 months, if convicted on both counts and given consecutive sentences, though actual sentencing outcomes for misdemeanor charges of this kind frequently fall well short of maximum statutory penalties, particularly for a first-time offender with no other documented criminal history of this specific kind. Jacobs' initial court appearance on these formal charges is scheduled for November 17th, timing that, as multiple outlets have noted, falls during the Packers' bye week, meaning it wouldn't require him to miss a scheduled game for the appearance itself, whatever else the case's eventual resolution might mean for his availability separately. We want to spend a moment on the specific allegation involving strangulation, because even though it doesn't appear in the final formal charges, we think it's worth explaining honestly why its initial inclusion and its subsequent absence both deserve careful treatment rather than being glossed over in either direction. Strangulation and suffocation charges are treated as felonies in Wisconsin specifically because of how dangerous and potentially lethal that specific category of physical harm is recognized to be, even in cases that don't result in visible, lasting injury. Domestic violence researchers and prosecutors nationally have increasingly emphasized strangulation specifically as one of the strongest documented predictors of future lethal violence in intimate partner relationships, which is part of why many jurisdictions, Wisconsin included, treat it as a distinct, more serious charge category rather than folding it into ordinary battery. That the original arrest included this specific charge, and that the ultimate formal complaint did not, is a genuinely significant shift, and we think the honest, responsible position is to say plainly that we don't currently have public access to the specific reasoning behind that particular charging decision beyond the DA's general statement about ongoing forensic review. It may reflect that the evidence available didn't support that specific charge to the standard required for prosecution. It may reflect a negotiated understanding about what charges would be filed. We don't know, and we're not going to fill that gap with a confident guess we can't actually support. There's a broader pattern here worth naming, because we've now covered similar dynamics in other cases on this channel. Initial arrest charges, filed by police at the scene based on preliminary information and the standard of probable cause, are not the same evidentiary category as formal charges filed by a prosecutor's office after weeks or months of review. That gap exists in essentially every serious criminal case working through the American legal system. And it exists for good procedural reasons. Police need to act quickly to protect potential victims and preserve evidence in the immediate aftermath of an incident, while prosecutors need considerably more time to build a case that can actually be proven in court to the necessary legal standard. Treating the original 5 charges as though they represent settled fact simply because they were the charges initially filed would be exactly the kind of imprecision we try to avoid on this channel. Treating the reduction to 2 misdemeanors as proof that nothing serious happened would be an equally unsupported leap in the opposite direction, particularly given that the underlying factual allegations, the physical struggle, the phone, the account of A&M being thrown to the ground and striking her head, remain part of the documented record, regardless of which specific charges a prosecutor ultimately determined could be proven. This isn't the first time Jacobs has generated headlines involving law enforcement, though the prior incident is of a considerably different character and severity. In January of 2021, while playing for the Raiders, Jacobs was arrested on suspicion of DUI following a single-vehicle crash near McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas, roughly 12 hours after a Raiders regular season finale. He was driving alone, suffered minor injuries including a cut requiring stitches, and was later released from custody. We include that detail not to suggest any pattern of behavior connects a 2021 DUI arrest to a 2026 domestic incident charge, two entirely different categories of alleged conduct separated by 5 years, but simply because a complete accounting of someone's documented history with law enforcement should include what's actually on the record in both directions, rather than curating only the details that fit a particular narrative. Where does this actually leave things? As of this recording, Josh Jacobs faces 2 Class A misdemeanor charges, battery and criminal damage to property, with an initial court appearance scheduled for November 17th. He has not been charged with domestic violence, strangulation, or witness intimidation, despite those charges appearing in his original arrest. The NFL's own separate investigation into the incident remains ongoing, operating independently of the criminal case's timeline and legal standard, and could result in league discipline, potentially including the 6-game suspension that applies as a baseline for a first domestic violence-related offense under the league's personal conduct policy, regardless of how the Wisconsin criminal case ultimately resolves. The Green Bay Packers have publicly acknowledged preparing for the possibility of a suspension while continuing to allow Jacobs to practice and play in the meantime. Surveillance footage from Jacobs' own garage reportedly captured at least part of the incident directly, footage that has been described in second-hand reporting but that the wider public has not seen in full. We think this case illustrates something worth carrying forward into how any of us evaluate similar stories as they develop. An arrest is a snapshot of what police believed they had probable cause to act on in the moment, often based on incomplete information gathered under time pressure at the scene of an active, ongoing incident. A formal charge, filed months later after forensic review, reflects a prosecutor's judgment about what can actually be proven in court, which is a meaningfully different standard, applied at a meaningfully different point in the process, with meaningfully more information available. Neither one, on its own, tells you the complete story, and treating either one as though it does, in either direction, risks either understating or overstating what's actually been established at any given moment in a case's timeline. Josh Jacobs is presumed innocent of the charges he currently faces. The case will proceed through Wisconsin's court system beginning with that November court date, and the NFL's own investigation will proceed on whatever timeline the league determines, informed by, but not necessarily bound to, however the criminal case itself resolves. We'll continue tracking both threads of this story as they develop, and we'll continue applying the same standard we try to bring to every case on this channel. What's actually been documented, held apart from whatever's simply being assumed, no matter which direction that assumption happens to point. This has been Forensic Disconnect. We unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered.